chapter because we get into leases, which is one of the primary things that property managers do, lease property. So the leasing chapter, the first thing we do is we define leasehold estates. We have 4 different leasehold estates. First one is estate by years. Second one is estate from period to period. Next one is tenancy at will and tenancy or sufferance. Those 4 different leasehold estates are covered in this chapter. You will want to focus on the differences in those 4 types of leases, leasehold estates, and just know basically the differences in those leasehold estates. Then we get into the type of lease payments. Gross lease, net lease, percentage lease, and the differences in those types of payments, lease payments. A gross lease is where the tenant pays just rent and that's it. So that's a type that, like an on-campus arrangement where the student would just pay rent and the university pays for the electric, all the utilities, and everything else. A net lease is just the opposite, where the landlord pays only the payment. Then the tenant pays for the maintenance, the property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance, and the utilities. So those are on that's the spectrum from gross lease to net lease. Now, as you can imagine, there will definitely be lease payment types in the middle. So when we get to that, that's where we have this category, or sometimes we call it gross lease minus, or gross lease minus electric, or something like that, where the tenant would actually pay the electric. But more times than that, we would consider those a certain type of net lease. So within the net lease category, we have net lease, net lease, and triple net lease. In a triple net lease, then the tenant would only pay, the tenant would pay everything. The landlord would only pay the payment, the mortgage payment. In a net lease, then the tenant pays some things, but not all things. And then in a net lease, even less things. So based on the scale, you have this general category called net lease. Then within that category, you have net lease, net lease, and triple net lease. I know that sounds very confusing, but I think after you read it in the book and you hear it in the lecture notes, I think it will make more sense. So I'll leave it at there. The third one, the percentage lease, we typically find in retail properties, and that's where the landlord, the owner, property manager gets a portion of the gross sales of the tenant. This is particularly good in malls and places like that. Now, that's the most difficult one because you have to audit and monitor what those gross sales are. So those are the 3 different type lease payments I want you to know: gross lease, net lease, and percentage lease. In this chapter, statute of frauds is covered. Statute of frauds is the legislation, if you will, the law that you will, that says that everything in real estate must be in writing. Okay, so everything has to be in writing. Now that's applicable in this because we're talking about leases. There are no verbal leases, so these leases have to be in writing. So there are essential parts to the lease. The essentials of essential elements of a lease are names and signatures, description of the premises, term of the lease, consideration, time and method of payment, the use of the premises, the rights and obligations of the parties, and the possession of the premises. So you'll study those in detail in this chapter. Payment options. We have step-up clauses, and a step-up clause, particularly in commercial leases. Commercial leases tend to be longer, 3 to 5 years. Well, what happens in that 3 to 5 years is the owner or the building manager's expenses will certainly go up. Property taxes increase, utilities increase, maintenance increases, and so they build in a step-up clause so that at separate periods, maybe even annually, that it would go up $1 a square foot or $100 a month or something like that, and we continue to increase that on an annual basis. Those are called step-up clauses. We also have an index lease, so that the lease would increase, or the amount that the tenant pays would increase based on some type of index, whether it is the LIBOR index, whether it is cost of living index. There's lots of indexes that you could tie this rent to, but the key is that they escalate, or there's some type of escalation clause, maybe based on an index, to get that particular rent up over time in these long leases. We may also have what we call a reappraisal lease, where periodically for really long-term leases, we would actually do an appraisal of the property and adjust the rent in regard to the appraisal difference. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about, that I wanted to talk about in this particular chapter. So go ahead and launch into it, and if you have any questions, as always, let me know. Thank you.